Hello and welcome to the Visiting Artists Lecture Series for Spring 2022. I want to encourage you to visit the Art and Art History website for more information about this historic program and all upcoming presentations. The next lecture in this series will be given by Sam Van Aken on April 12th. This presentation will include the artist talk followed by a short Q&A moderated by me. Once the presentation is finished, please type your question in the chat box to the right of the video on YouTube. My name is Natalie Thedford, and I am a first-year MFA student in the ceramics area. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Cammie Staros. Staros is an artist from Nashville, Tennessee, and is currently based out of Los Angeles, California. She creates sculptures that draw from classical antiquities and the context in which we view them. Through a combination of ancient techniques, contemporary sensibility, and museological display, her work folds the past in on itself to reveal semiotic systems developed and reinforced through art history. Staros references relics from antiquity, like Greek vases, as objects which support a reflection on the past. Her work questions the dominant narrative that places these relics in her own Greek lineage at the origin of the Western canon. At the same time, her sculpture is consistent with epic Greek narrative tradition, can be considered as prophetic objects in space for contemplation on the future. Staros received her BA in Art and Semiotics from Brown University in 2006 and her MFA from the California Institute of the Arts in 2011. She has presented solo exhibitions with Lux Art Institute, as well as Shulamit Nazarian, Francois Gabali, and Lefebvre and Fee's galleries. Her work has also been featured in several survey shows and texts about contemporary sculpture or ceramics, including the recent Thames and Hudson title, 100 Sculptures of Tomorrow. Staros has received a number of awards, grants, and residencies, and in 2020 was named a Guggenheim Fellow. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Cammie Staros.
Thank you, Natalie, for that warm introduction, and thank you to everyone at Boulder for having me, for coming to this lecture, and for inviting me in campus, in person, on campus, into your studios. It's been a real pleasure. I did not make this first piece, as you might gather. My work really centers around ideas of art history and its construction. So I'm going to show some images of the things I look at along with the works I make at the same time. And these first few are examples of Greek black figure vases, which I return to over and over again. Athens was the hub of this kind of amphora or vase. And the examples that I look at a lot were mostly made between about 400 and 650 BCE. The figuration is usually narrative, detailing allegories, conquests, and sports triumphs. As Natalie said, I concentrated in art and semiotics in college, and also attended a pretty theory-heavy grad school. And I did do a fair amount of art history too, but it was really my interest in semiotics, at least as much as history, that led me to using these antiquities as a kind of conceptual springboard. Semiotics is often just defined as the study of the sign, which I find to be a vague and self-referential definition. It means nobody knows what it is. But more generally, I would say that it's like the cultural philosophy concerned with how meaning is made and conveyed, and particularly relevant to how that's accomplished visually. So true to that semiotics foundation, I realized soon after grad school that art history itself is kind of the visual system of communication that attracted me to art in the first place and that ultimately compels me. So I started getting really interested in these figure vases, both because of their narrative representational nature and because for me they came to represent almost like an origin story of Western art history. And I wanted to complicate that narrative and also to use it as a shorthand for the drive to make and the drive to tell a story about the past and the empirical drive. And I also wanted my work to be both about and of its own historical lineage and the broader systems for telling these stories. So in parallel with the antiquities themselves, I'm really interested in how that history is conveyed. And by that, I mean, how the image is cropped, how the pedestal functions, how the vitrine protects, and the museum sort of frames its collections and its objects, all these ways in which objects are institutionalized and the signs of importance around them. So put another way, as Natalie said, I'm interested in both antiquities and the context in which we view them. So the very first things I made on the subject with Greek ceramics were these drawings that I did of a standard art historical text. So I did not touch ceramics in undergrad or grad school. I was doing a lot of sculpture, but I came to ceramics later. And so I did these drawings like before really knowing anything about clay. And I drew the pots and the shadows and the glares and these weird croppings from these photographs, but left out the namesake figures and also the captions, kind of those places we turn to for meaning. I was interested in what was left and how much could be identified about the type of book and the type of object being described. But a few drawings did not satiate my appetite for the subject. And I knew I wanted to make sculptures that related to the ideas and to these antiquities. But I didn't really know what form they would eventually take. I did know that I would need to start working in clay. So I did a residency in Colorado, actually, at Anderson Ranch outside of Aspen, which is really well known for its ceramics, although I got in for sculpture, having never done ceramics before. I had thrown a little bit, but I had not really hand-built ceramics before. And there I weaseled my way into the ceramics department, and I started building by coil and doing more hand-built ceramics, and also using these, using the red clay and the terra sigillata and the materials that the ancient Greeks and Romans used, and really sort of building that material backbone of my practice there. So these, first few pieces, these are some of the first ceramics I ever made. And I don't really consider them pieces. I just call them pieces, but I don't consider them pieces. I knew my interest was in making sculptures that dealt with these ideas, but not in making updated versions of ancient Greek vessels. So really, I was making these things, but none of them, nor their combination, I really considered finished pieces. This one is one of the first sculptures I did complete in this new medium, and marks the beginning of, I don't know, the rest of my life. Marks the beginning of my first solo show, also at Francois Cavalli, which I'll go through. And it also marks my move away from conventional construction, although I had been hand building, but in doing things like making my vessels upside down. So part of that was to make the sculptures work, but a lot was to draw this distinction between utility and inutility, between a pot and the sculpture of a pot. So you can see, this is a bad photo, but you can see that it's open at sort of what looks like the foot of the vase. And it's solid at the lip. And it also became important to the way ceramic elements functioned alongside the other elements I was working with. In this case, these sort of kind of hieroglyphic walnut arms. I also began making them hollow all the way through. This one is titled Leda, for a Greek allegory that gets depicted a lot and has been depicted a lot in art history, which is the story of Zeus taking the form of a swan to seduce or rape, depending on the version, young Leda on the eve of her wedding. And you can see that this piece is held up by this series of penetrations. I think it's also a good example of a thing that I do a lot in my practice, which I talked about with one or two of you today, which is just embodying kind of apparent contradictions. So having work that can be both funny and serious at the same time, or elegant and lewd, and especially close to my heart is being both conceptual and crafted. Part of my interest in these few first ones are all this first solo show, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and then I'm going to hopefully go a little bit faster through a couple more shows and then talk a lot about the most recent work too. But part of my interest in how objects are displayed and viewed is in relation to how bodies are displayed and viewed. So the blinds in this piece and an interest in clothing and just like kind of a love of precarity are all things that point to this like revealing and concealing of the body as compared to that of the object. And from the beginning, many of my works kind of flirt at the edges of figuration and anthropomorphism, or contend with how bodies use space in architecture. Like this piece these are standard doorway sizes as the negative space. And that first piece that I showed you in the corner, and many more that I have made that are related to it with similar like walnut arms, I hang at the height of my own shoulders. So there's lots of sort of bodily and architectural decisions in the work like that. And of course, I'm thinking about these works in relationship to various histories. So I have an interest in folding in allusions. I think that like antiquity, ancient Greece is kind of the most forward, most obvious one a lot of the times, but I incorporate a lot of references to for this show in particular, modernism and non-European histories, but for different bodies of works, various other references. So I've made several works in this vein, but this one was the first, and these stacked sculptures point to the formal and functional similarities, I think, between Greek ceramics and those native to the Americas. And I also think that the repetitive undulations reference modernist sculptures like Brancusi's endless column, as well as Northwest American totems. And so layering all those incongruous references is kind of a way for me to address the murky and malleable material of influence, precedence, and understanding, which I think is really interesting and a big part of why I'm interested in art history as a subject matter. I also, this image looks very green on my screen, but it's not in person. But I really try to avoid making didactic work or even work with like a singular read, preferring along with my layerings of references, also and allusions, also making kind of visual analogies and allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. I refer to my work sometimes as polymorphic. So like because the figuration on the source material on those ancient Greek pots is so tied to the meaning of those pots, my love of ambiguity means that I tend to avoid direct figuration. So the birds in this topmost ceramic are about as close as I've come, but as you can see, they are also eyes. So even within that, they're sort of doing double duty. But I do regularly reference the figure in the form and attitude of the vessel. So the other reason that I don't really depict figuration is because I want the pieces themselves to really be the subjects, not figures on their bellies or necks. I also really like that vases have bodily terms like bellies and necks and lips and feet. Anyway, this piece called Reclining Nude plays with multiple art historical allusions, including that namesake trope and the Greek amphora, fractured columns, and especially that well-worn body as a vessel theme. And I'm really interested in the ways that historic motifs and tropes can affect our artistic expression and understanding. They can sometimes a trope sort of has a connotation of being tired with it, but I feel like it's a place where you can have a little fun with them. So these are some classical reclining nudes, and a modern one that's a Milois and a Henry Moore. So I've talked about works a little bit in relationship to architecture and the body and to history. And I would just add that I'm also interested in how they relate to each other. I think shows have this opportunity to build meaning from one piece to the next in a kind of like syntactical structure. So in that vein, I installed this guy in reference as a shadow to that column piece. So that's an installation shot. And of course, it's not literal. It's not right in front of it, but it's close enough that I think you get that reference. And I didn't know it at the time, but I actually think this first solo show is a good establishing shot of my interests. Through grad school, I really thought of myself as someone who didn't work serially, which, seems laughable now. I was very clearly mistaken. But one of the advantages of working serially is that your later illusions can kind of become a little bit less legible and further afield, I think, because you're now building on a sort of constellation of references and interests that you've already established for yourself. And I think I have done that. That's just another view of the same show. And then I got as one show sort of leads to the next, I got an invitation to make and exhibit a show in Paris. So after making all these works that referenced Brancusi, I went to his atelier. So these are on the right-hand side. Those column pieces are the endless columns that I referenced earlier. I was asked recently why I focus on the modern and contemporary artists that I reference, and it's really similar to the Greek relics. I reference work that is iconic and has come to symbolize its time or movement in some way. So I think of Brancusi as kind of the epitome of modernist sculpture. And I knew for this show in Paris that I wanted to specifically look at these icons who spent their working lives in Paris and loomed so large in that city. This is, of course, Picasso. And so I was connecting these Paris-based icons of modern and also surrealist art with the histories that had inspired them. You can really see, I think, some of the classical influences on Picasso in these like busts that he did. And I was also looking at surrealism. These are Marcel Bruters. And I was reading a lot of André Breton and Georges Bataille, so I was maybe reading as much surrealist work as looking at it. And I came up with this show. I had a French assistant for a month, which was very nice, of my production time. And I spoke only French to him, and he spoke only English back to me. So when the gallery asked me to write a press release, I was like, I don't know, language did not come quickly to me. And the thing that came out of me was more like a poem that borrowed some expressions from the surrealists I was reading and funny translations, and some notes that I had been taking as I walked around Paris. So all the titles to this show are excerpts from that writing piece, including the title of the show, which is The Double Beast Coupled, which is also the name of this, the piece on the right. Why are my slides aren't advancing? Help. Yeah, it's just sticking on that one.
Hey, hi, I'm Ben, everyone. Can you share it again? Like just close it out and then go back through the whole sharing process.
How do I close it out?
Like just let's see.
Stop screen? That sounds maybe dangerous. Or just should I share it a second time?
Let me actually, yeah, okay. Yeah, try to. I can't remove it for some reason. Okay. Yeah, try to just share it again, go back through the process, and hopefully that'll work.
Did it pop up again?
No. Okay.
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, see if you can like stop sharing it and then reshare it.
Just in case you wanted a refresher on all those previous pieces. Yeah. What is up with that image?
Shit.
I mean, I'm still, I removed it from our, whatever they call it, stage or whatever, but I'm still using the same version. I can just fully try uploading it again.
Yeah, that might be the way to do it. It's yeah, it doesn't seem to have brought in the end of the slideshow. I'm not sure what that's all about.
Yeah, I don't know. I am you doing well. No, I can't imagine that it would have anything to do with that. Now's the part of the lecture where I just start like miming my pieces and you can imagine them and I'll describe them.
This is all because I just gave that whole speech on how StreamYard has worked really well for us. Okay. The other thing also, send me the PPT and we'll see in case it's a, something with the internet over there. Yeah. Oh, it's working. We'll see if it stays working, but it is advancing. Okay.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay.
I'm going to remove
right?
myself.
Yes. This is the next slide. Sorry, everybody, and thank you for your patience. Where was I in that stream of thought? This piece is probably the first one that I've exhibited publicly that centers display devices so prominently, although it is something that I worked with in grad school and maybe even college a little bit. This is just an install shot, but I'll go through these. So that's another one of those stacked pieces, a little darker. And this is the first work that I did with neon, with more of those walnut arms. I'd wanted to work with neon for a while, and my thinking on it changes a little bit with each project. But in the beginning with this one, it seemed like sculpting with a line, with like a charged line, like kind of going to the essence of the difference between 2 and 3 dimensions. So it becomes, for me, the things one can draw with a single line in space: a snake, a rope, a string, a sign. And by combining it with these sort of arm bracket things and making it a thing that could be held, I felt like I was further objectifying that line of light. And I was also thinking about Picasso's light drawings, of freezing that kind of gesture in an object. So he made these by drawing with a pin light, so they could only be seen in a photograph made with a long exposure. Francois Guillot, who was his partner at the time, also made them, by the way, but Picasso's the famous one. So that's who the images are of that you can find. This piece feels the most surrealist to me. I showed you those brutes with all the shells, and I just kept coming across these comparisons or conflations between eyes and eggs and pearls and shells. So I made this piece kind of in response. And I also used real shells too. If you look closely at this piece, you can see scallop shells acting as shims for this rather large ceramic sculpture with a rounded bottom. I'm always making things that can't hold themselves up, or sometimes that just look like they can't. In this case, actually couldn't, which also illustrates another of my kind of pet philosophies, or this piece in general, I think does. Not so much the fact that it can't hold itself up. That is just a thing I do, assuming that whatever my fix is going to be is going to complicate the piece and make it better. But a different thing about this piece is that I feel like it illustrates this sort of, I don't know, personal mantra that I try to keep in mind, which is just to respect and reward the viewer. So this piece was visible from this angle in the show, but it was in kind of a niche and had to be sort of squeezed around. But for those curious enough to do so, they got this wholly other view and another layer of meaning. And I think from this angle, the piece becomes the most pointed reference to Picasso. So, and then this is a jump, like that when, as soon as I got back from Paris, basically, Shulamit Nazarian invited me to do a show, which was also a pretty quick turnaround time. I made the show in Paris there. So that was, quick by nature. And it might have been partially the quick turnaround time of this now second show in that year, but also I think it had to do just where my head was at the time. But I wanted to play with the differences in convention between a solo show at a gallery and at a historical museum, where those kind of monograph shows or solo shows often include works by influential predecessors and peers. So for this show, I like curated in some specific pieces. So all of the photographs, paintings, and collages are works by other artists that I picked for this show. So on the right of this photo is one by Sarah Vanderbeek titled Baltimore Aphrodite. And the works that I chose all dealt with some of the same ideas I was thinking about, namely heroic, sexuality, classical form, and the construction of all those ideas. And I particularly liked this pairing of Vanderbeek's oversized photograph of the decapitated Greco-Roman statue and my sculpture in the center here. It's sort of a jug that I thought of also as a disembodied head and its helmet. And for this neon, I thought of it as kind of like a snake charmed out of its pot, or a wisp of smoke rising, or like the most beautiful entrails. And I mentally sort of categorize the work in this show as in 4 categories. So the works by other artists were one, and the large sculptures that I was doing were all in one way or another kind of disembodied heads. And then there were these 2 kinds that I'll talk about more, these wall slabs and these pierced pots. And with all these works, I was looking at artifacts that aestheticize eroticism, violence, and victory with an eye towards contemporary counterparts. So rather than looking at, like, I don't know, tactical military gear or something like that, I'm finding vestiges of that ancient armor in like piercing, tattoos, leather, and fetish gear. The title of this work is Eros and Anteros, which comes from 2 of the erots, the winged love gods in Greek mythology, and can be translated roughly as love and requited love. And these ceramics I think of as, again, this amphora shape, this vase shape, inverted to resemble heads with the handles scaled down like ears. And the photo on the left is by Whitney Hubbs. So the zipper motif itself on this piece is like a combination of a Greek key and rows of triangles, both common patterns in Athenian black figure vases themselves. But the resulting pieces, I think, look like ancient vessels with neoprene koozies or heads with leather masks, like this kind of mask, roughly. I have several pieces. I've made several pieces that are this basic shape. This is the only one in that show. But it also like shows some of the ideas I was thinking about with these pieces more clearly than the others. Namely, the vulnerability contained in a head on its side as if fallen or resting. And it conjures up ruins, I think, more explicitly, like the fallen overhead, which I'll talk more about later. But 2 examples of aslant disembodied heads held particular resonance for me. These Medusa heads pillaged from Roman ruins and repurposed as column bases in the Basilica Cistern in Istanbul, and Brancusi's Sleeping Muse. And these 2 models came to represent for me kind of 2 poles, the literal and the metaphoric borrowing of classical forms, depictions of women as femme fatale or as a muse, and the vanquished head and the sleeping one. And this piece, again, sort of like that last piece in the Paris show that I showed, the face was actually turned towards the wall or towards a corner of the room. So you had to like walk around it to get that eye. And you can see the simplified ovular form of this piece kind of points to the Brancusi, while the snakes covering its surface, of course, allude to Medusa's serpentine locks. And this column, my sort of stand-in column, is rusted pipe. So again, kind of referencing that the cistern where those Medusa heads were repurposed, and its watery function now, and also the violence of her story. So this is one of those Medusa heads in that cistern, which is quite famous. It's not like I discovered it, although that would be great. And this is the other one. And nobody really knows why they're turned like they are, but there's some theories. Maybe to ward off her penetrating gaze. And these are 2 examples of many of Brancusi's that I was looking at. This is Fay Ray, is the collage. And this is one of those piercing pots that I mentioned. And I just showed them on the floor like this. You can also kind of get a sense of scale in that image. But in previous shows, and even in that previous piece that I just showed, I was using like the positioning and the weight of vessels to get a bodily read. I'm thinking specifically about that Reclining Nude piece, but about others as well. And with this show, I started using other ways that we manipulate our bodies, designs mimicking clothing, as I mentioned earlier, tattooing, and like with this piece, piercing the pot. So I'm playing with them, with this particular one, I'm playing with this pattern that kind of alternates between a column and a dress, you know, or between a solid form and a supple one. And these rings are made with balls that screw onto the ends, like oversized septum or navel rings. This one, the pattern is based on chainmail, and the piercings are, of course, also stand-ins for handles, these ones at the top. And those ones are made like posts with butterfly clutches, for those of you who have piercings. It's just a detail of that pattern. And this chainmail pattern itself, like the way that I decided to depict chainmail, came from this rubbing of a British tomb from the Middle Ages that my mother did a rubbing of before it was illegal. And I grew up with it in my house. It's like, 5 feet tall or something. And the chainmail is done the same way in this. But also I was looking, of course, at the like little outfits on these Greek figure bases. This one's Athena, and you can always tell Athena from her shield and helmet. And this one is titled Minerva, which is the Roman name for Athena. But these are the last of those 4 categories that I mentioned. So they're these wall slabs that are all based on armor, real or imagined, as might be depicted on those same Greek urns. So you can see it's kind of like modernized, simplified form. Maybe not of that one exactly, but close. And these ones are all named for goddesses or Greek heroines. This one I think is Bia, which is kind of the represented as power or force or raw energy. And Anthropos is one of the fates. Hippolyta was queen of the Amazons, famed for her war belt, which Heracles was tasked with stealing. So that was the end of that show. This is not part of that show, but I made it just afterwards and kind of in the same frame of mind. And you can see I'm still working with some of the same kind of patterning, but also in this image, you can see how those piercings work. Another neon. This piece is a lot bigger than it looks in an image, but I mentioned I was in Elise's studio. We were talking about breaks and planned breaks, and this is a piece that I made sort of like a puzzle with the intention of making this neon repair. So there's a Chinese and Japanese tradition of repairing broken porcelain, mostly by epoxying it back together and then gold leafing the break so that the broken piece becomes more valuable than the original unbroken, which I think is such a lovely tradition. And this is my sort of nod to that tradition, but using light instead of gold. So despite falling hard for extreme detail, which I clearly do sometimes, I actually have a lot of minimalist instincts, and I often try to reduce a reference down to its most essential features. So a few years ago, I started working with more bare clay pieces, and doing things like with these pieces, I've made a couple like this now. I have to like really dial in the clay body and the temperature where I'm firing to get that kind of ombre. I also wanted to make vulnerable, intimate, organic shapes with this same reference that I've been coming back to for years. And I wanted to incorporate the materials and forms used to display the antiquities that I keep referencing. So way back in the beginning of this talk, I spoke about the museum and display, but other interests had kind of pulled me in different directions, and I wanted to get back to that element of my interests. And so I think of these acrylic elements as kind of part pedestal and part vitrine. And you can see that the ceramics themselves are not only bent and twisted, but they also all have these pointed bottoms, so they can't stand up on their own. And I think of that inability to stay upright as a way of reiterating the incorporation of the acrylic elements as a really integral part of the piece. And part of the idea of using that material language of display is about this conceptual shift from thinking about the historical role of ancient objects to thinking about them as allegories for the future of today's objects. And I will talk more about that too. But this image, that idea kind of carried me into this most recent show, and this image marks the beginning of that show. And for that show, like the way that I sort of conceived it was to imagine a museum that had been forgotten and reclaimed by nature, which really, you know, could almost be the definition of a relic or a ruin, that reclamation by nature or time of the human made. And I started really thinking about how relics trace the fall of empire and expose the fragility of human power and the drive for it. And where I had been focusing more on the historical role of these objects I was referencing, I became more interested in the future that they suggested. So my response to some of the events of the last 5 or 6 years was wanting to combine this clearly well-documented interest of mine in these Greek antiquities and these fruits of fallen empires with the political and environmental threats to our own moment, and also to project forward into a time when today's objects might be considered relics and ruins in turn. So I think of these pieces as sort of half vase and half shell, or as analogies of things we creatures leave behind. And with that, I'm thinking also about like the drive to make in the first place and how that is sort of our animal impulse. And I'm thinking about how the objects are displayed in museums and how that's done really tells a story of the human endeavor, or else organizes and classifies the natural world, right? A lot of museums do one of those things, or both. So I'm giving every piece in this show Latin titles following the taxonomic structure used for a specimen in a natural history museum. Again, just playing with and pointing to institutional conventions and the ways in which they determine meaning and kind of frame our experience. And I think the heart of that idea, or the place where those two ideas really come together most forcefully, or dare I say fluidly, are these vitrines that are also aquariums. So they're referencing just systems of display found in like the Greek wings of the Metropolitan Museum or the British Museum, the so-called encyclopedic museums that likewise encase these classical sculptures. And they highlight devices that frame the way we view these historical objects and animals alike. You know, they're similar. To me, the use of water in these systems really evokes the threats of flood and drought. So I said earlier that I was sort of responding to, did I say that? Maybe I didn't say it, but I was responding to a feeling of sort of impending political or climate crises. And these were actually the first pieces that I thought of. I think submerging these ceramic objects points to the transition of that material from mud, which would of course disintegrate in water, to this fired form that can far outlast its maker, which is pretty amazing. The ones I'm referencing again are like 2,000 years old and are often found underwater for reference. And I also think that these kind of drowned museological displays like flatten historical time, sort of simultaneously suggesting the ancient past, these underwater discoveries, the contemporary display of these objects, and also, again, a possible future of today's objects. And as I said in the beginning, like I really think of my work as being both of and about its lineage. So maybe it was only a matter of time before I began to question not only kind of how we got to this moment in art history, but also where it's going and what may become of it. This piece is kind of a traditional shape that I then doubled and conjoined. And this one looks pretty straight as you approach it. But from the side you can see it's pretty distorted. So just to be clear about what's going on in these images, I tend to like kind of talk about the big ideas that I'm having, but some of the nitty gritty is I'm working with aquarium fabricators to make these custom tanks. So the mechanics of the system that you see in most aquariums are all there, but they're all hidden, a way to maintain the illusion and the reference to vitrines. And this mirroring effect that happens when you look at them at an angle was, to be honest, just a happy surprise. And like museological vitrines often are, they're all self-lit, which allowed me to play with the lighting in the space a lot, which you've seen in some of the images and which I'll talk about more. But it also gives them the same sort of like halo of celebrated object. And they also shift over the course of the day. So the lights are programmed to echo the movement of the sun. So they're always shifting in more ways than one. This is the last of the aquarium vitrine pieces. And with all these pieces, the aquarium vitrines, I really wanted the ceramics to appear distorted or conjoined, or in this case, like vaguely zoomorphic in form, as if they've all kind of adapted to their watery habitats in one way or another, or to seem like the objects were kind of sinking back towards an organic state. So you can see this one is, there are actually a lot of amphora, of traditional amphora with pointed bottoms that were used for shipping. And so you can see the handles are sort of the tail fins of this like shark-like or catfish-like form of the twisted vase that kind of becomes this fishy form. Again, just showing how the piece shifts over time. So this is like sunset lighting, I think. And as I started to mention, these were like the first pieces I imagined for this show, although they took the longest to make. But once I made that conceptual shift from using this family of references that I keep coming back to think about historical precedents and understanding, and shifting it to think about prescience and how our own moment will be remembered, these pieces sort of came to me pretty quickly, but took a lot longer to produce. So I'm going back to this slide so you can see some of the other things in the room. This room is usually lit by a grid of fluorescents. And so I made these big neons, like fat neons, that are the same size as a fluorescent tube, and hung them in place of the usual tubes to mimic fluorescence as if they had discolored and dripped out of their sockets. So all the color in these spaces is coming from these lights, which people have thought before that it was painted. And in a few cases, you can kind of make it out. I don't even know if I have an image of it, but in a few cases, like in the neon that's sort of most clear in this image, that's most straight on, there's a glass puddle that's the same color as the light, kind of under that sort of dripping light. And I did talk to, there's no paint or anything, but I did talk to a couple of lighting designers that I know to kind of heighten the experience of the color, and especially from transitioning from one color to another. So your eyes would kind of begin to adjust within a room, and then these transitions made the next color seem all the more intense. And using light in this way to kind of address the physiognomy of the viewer is new to me, But again, I'm constantly trying to bring the viewer's awareness back to their own bodies in space, whether it's like their sort of fear of stray elbows with those tall stacked pieces, or squeezing around pieces, or reflecting attitudes. So I really like imagining that a viewer becomes aware of themselves viewing, and this was another way to kind of get at that from a different angle. And I was using the lights in this show as a key part of the installation, but not really as standalone sculptures. I did turn a bunch of them into that after the show. So this is like not part of the show. You can see it does not have a Latin title, but I made these marble hands to hold up some of them, and with the pink lights, which I haven't even shown you the pink room, but with these pink ones, I used this pink travertine and made kind of a channel for the bulb, sort of like that fluorescent bracket or socket that I was using, but out of these rough stones. These are titled using snippets of Sappho, because I tend to have sort of an organizing principle for titles, not always, but often for a body of work, but those principles shift over time. And they get a little bit lost in the drama of this lighting, but the first stone pieces I carved were in that show. So that travertine piece came afterwards, but these green onyx arches was the first stone piece that I did. And I picked this onyx with its many pits and veins, and it already had this kind of bite out of it in the corner. To make obvious the natural forces at work on the material before I came to it, I really liked those sort of pieces of evidence. And also to make it look like it was dissolving a bit at the edges. I think of stone as having as being kind of a twin medium with this reference to antiquity, but is also a geological marker of time. And with these particular ones that I was doing, I was thinking of classical ruins, or like a Roman bathhouse or something. And with the works in this show, I was really thinking about how things change over time. So the aquarium works are obviously dynamic and changing moment by moment. But the other works in the show, the static works, I still wanted to have that feeling of a potential for change. So like where the shell vases feel maybe caught in the moment of adapting or evolving, hopefully these stone pieces feel like they're already eroding, which is maybe a slower movement, but a movement nonetheless. And also just like thinking a lot about all of the meaning and generation in both of those kinds of change. And so I'm really, this is the pink room. So I'm really thinking with this work and continuing, this is closest to what I'm working on now, this show. So I'm really thinking about both history and time, but sometimes distinguishing between those two, and sometimes sort of using one as a shorthand for the other. You can see one of the other neons at the top of this image in its ballast. I didn't really talk about this, I don't think, with the earlier shell vases, but the way that I was doing these was to kind of slice through them before the clay was very hard, and also, in case you're trying this at home, before I had built very high. And bending the pieces back on itself. And I really wanted that incision to be both a break and the point of generation, where the one thing started evolving into the other. So this is the armature that goes with this one, which is obviously not a freestanding pedestal like the others, but this armature kind of gets the coziest with its ceramic. It goes inside of that teeny tiny little handle, which, by virtue of being the weirdest, makes it my favorite. This one's a little bit more straightforward. And this one is, I know we're running short on time. This is the last piece that I will show. So I was thinking about the Capitoline she-wolf in Rome, this famous sculpture, and her fabulous teats. And I was thinking about Louise Bourgeois, who I believe has also considered fabulous teats. She did this pink piece, but she also did this pink piece, which I really like how it stands on its points. And then, you know, part of doing that piece that I was thinking of sort of as teats was that it was partly a fragment, as in the case of that wolf, but of course I also wanted it to be a distinct whole. And then later, after I actually made the form, I started thinking about choral and collective organisms that work together. And so really hoping to have it be kind of like part whole, part fragment, and part collective. So these porcelain points inside were how I spent the first few months of this pandemic, but felt kind of fitting. I don't know. A student recently asked me kind of how I made this piece, and specifically like thinking about planning versus on-the-fly decisions, which I think is a really good question. And this is a good piece that he picked out to ask about. I really try to stay kind of open and elastic to changes. I think it complicates work and makes it weirder. The just sort of straightforward how I did this was upside down. So I started by building on this ledge and then built towards the nipple points and built them all at the same time so that, you know, the clay would all shrink at the same rate, and made sure, used a board on top of those points and would make sure it was level. But only after making that piece and flipping it over and like feeling like it wasn't totally complete did I decide to make these porcelain points. Also, there had just been a lockdown. And so deciding to take on this super repetitive, laborious task seemed a little bit more doable than it maybe would have at a different moment. And I also made these kind of like offering bowl things for it. And so I just say that kind of because, you know, one of the reasons why art lectures are a big part of a lot of art education is because there's no single way to do this job. And there's no advice that fits for everyone. But the advice that I think I have for like the biggest number of people is to stay open and to stay elastic, both within works themselves, but also with how you think of your practice more broadly. So like, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I really never thought that I would be working serially when I was in grad school. And when I began to work in ceramics and with these reference, I would not have predicted that I would still be at it 10 years later. But although I wouldn't have been able to predict where that initial interest would take me, I do hope that all of those layers of references over time of thinking about this sort of world of ideas deeper and deeper allow that specific historical reference to kind of open up broader questions about why we make things, about the relationship of those things to time and nature, about stories of the past and what we leave out and what we leave behind. So I'm doing different things, I think, with different pieces. And if you have questions about specific ones, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But if I were to tie this talk up with a neat little bow, I would say that as I move forward, I think these paths that I'm exploring and these sort of like directions that I'm taking are more or less coming together to kind of circle questions about the nature of making histories and what in the end will be the legacy of our species. That went way over, and I very much appreciate your patience for any of you who are still with us. Thank you so much again for having me. And yeah, if there is time, I don't really know what the deal is, but if there is time, I'm still happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cammie. It's really enjoyable just to hear about all of the different layers and associations that you're bringing into your work. And I'll remind, I think that we could still do some questions. And so if you want to put those in the chat, that would be great. I'll start out with one. I was really struck by your pieces in the aquarium, and for me the contrast was so sharp between it seemed like the individual ceramic pieces, except for maybe that one piece that was kind of like a pairing, but it was still connected as one. In contrast to the fish and the school of fish, or the collective, and maybe also the plants. So just struck by the isolation of the ceramic piece, in contrast to the fish. Wondering any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely one day I'm going to build a giant one with lots of little ceramic pieces in them. So I wasn't so much thinking about the like solitary versus the communal aspect of them necessarily. I mean, I was with specific pieces, but not as like a rule of thumb for going forwards. I do really like when like the snails crawl on the ceramics or the fish go through the holes or whatever. I really like the interaction. And I think that it kind of highlights that thing that you're talking about of them feeling like kind of lonely characters in this foreign landscape.
Yeah, great. And then I've got a question from Katie here. She says, I'm so intrigued by your process and the range of representation among your works. Do you work directly from a plan, or do you work more intuitively? I think you spoke a little bit about that towards the end. How do you know when a series is finished? What dictates your next pivot in the work?
Well, a lot of times I work on multiple series at the same time, or I dip back into them. And so like, for example, with those walnut arm things, I've like come back to that form over and over again over years and use them to sort of hold up different things or use them in different ways. And I kind of think of that as a series that's like one thing, but then do other things. And I suspect the aquarium vitrines will become something similar, that it's something that I return to, but it doesn't have to be like a temporal series. So that's one answer. With regards to how much I plan, it really depends on the piece. With big pieces, like they often just take more engineering. And sometimes I figure that out the hard way. I actually don't do that many sketches. And when I do, half the time it's for other people because they can't see inside my head, which is a lesson I'm constantly relearning. But I'll have an idea of like something I want to do, or I'll often do a sketch, but then like not actually reference it while I'm making, which is just, I don't know, out of laziness or because my hands are always covered in clay. So I don't know, it's a mix. And then other works, I like, have a plan and I move forward.
Yeah, great. I got another question from Kara. Are you drawn to a specific mythology or set of mythologies in Greek sculpture more than another? If so, why?
I mean, at any given moment I am, but they shift a lot. I have just recently read like, I don't know, a dozen retellings of the Iliad. But that's partly because there are so many. But I'm researching actually a different myth right now. It's just that the Iliad's the one that's available. But a lot of them are like kind of more women focused or more feminist readings, but definitely not exclusively. Right now, I'm interested a lot in the myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth, and that again of being this sort of like half beast, half man, which there are a lot of in Greek mythology, to be fair, but using one as a different sort of access point for this idea of like man versus nature as opposed to being two parts of the same thing.
Yeah. Another question here. You didn't speak about the role of skill in your work, but it seems that your execution, having a kind of equivalency to the quality of their historical antecedents, is important. Could you talk a bit about the role of skilled labor?
Yeah, well, you and I, Natalie, did talk about that a little bit. And I am, I showed you the very first ceramics I made. So it's not that I didn't start making this work knowing that I had a skill in ceramics or something. But I think that kind of finish that the questioner is probably referring to is as much a personality trait as an ability. I tend to aim for whatever symmetry, smoothness, like precarity, a lot of like tiny balances. But I often throw obstacles in my own way because I actually respond a lot to work that isn't pristine. I think pristine can like be kind of a dangerous zone, and also just like a lot to keep up with, a really high bar to set for yourself. So I throw obstacles in my own way, like for example, taking on new materials, which sort of mandate that things aren't going to be done maybe the way that an expert would. But I think there's often like freedom in that, and then like having experience in other materials gives you a sort of different perspective on new ones. But some of it is also just practical. Like if I'm going to paint on a piece, it has to be kind of smooth to get any kind of detail.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's a mix.
Yeah, that's great. And then we have a comment from Dan. It says, I really enjoy this idea of decay as a returning to nature rather than this perception of decay as becoming nothing. If you wanted to.
Me too.
Like
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in that. I just read a proposal for a project to use kind of digital technologies to speed up decay as opposed to warding them off. I feel like so many sort of human endeavors and human technologies are about like containing nature and like keeping the effects of time at bay. And so I was interested in kind of using similar technologies for the opposite to sort of speed up those processes. Yeah, I mean, nature is like a wild, cruel, all-powerful beast, right? And I think we could all do well to remember that more often.
Yeah. And then maybe we'll do this as the last question here from Liz. Hi, Cammie. As you work in series, when do you find that a series is done? Do you look at the work as a singular whole made of parts or as a singular pieces existing together?
That's a good question. I'm definitely more interested in opportunities to do, I wouldn't say more interested. I mean, often more interested to do solo shows, which is why I showed you all solo shows, because it does trigger this kind of like, I don't know, making a menu of pieces, and it gives me ideas to think about works really in relationship to each other. But I do still, hope that the pieces are strong enough to stand on their own. And a lot of them are kind of like, circling the same set of ideas, just sort of slightly differently. When to know that I'm done with a series, again, is really a hard question because I often end up sort of going back to things. And I feel like my whole practice is sort of serial at this point. But I think it just happens. I think they just get phased out, honestly, because like I did those, just for example, I did those like pedestal pieces with the first sort of like vulnerable vases that felt kind of like organs or something. And then that kind of transitioned into those like shell pots. And then those sort of transitioned to the wall. And then, it kind of like one thing sort of begets the next.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for all of those thoughts. And I think we'll continue to mull over them after this. Did you have any thoughts that you wanted to end with, or?
I feel like I've had so many thoughts. Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk with you all again more tomorrow. And And thank you again for having me here.
Yeah, thank you so much.